Good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be here in Beirut this morning. And I want to first thank Dr. Chidiac. Dr. Chidiac is someone who we have an enormous amount of respect for, not just here in Beirut, but also in Washington. And when given the invitation to come, she is the kind of person who can get us on a plane from Washington and come to Beirut. So thank you. And I also want to acknowledge the members of the Lebanese government who are here today, and acknowledge my friend and colleague Tom Fletcher, the United Kingdom's ambassador to Lebanon, who I want to make a prediction, and for those of you who don't know Ambassador Fletcher, you should get to know him, and I want you to remember this prediction. You heard it here first. Within the next 12 years, Tom Fletcher will be Foreign Secretary in the United Kingdom. See if we can come back in 12 years and let me know if I'm right. I bet I will be. I also want to acknowledge the United States' ambassador to Lebanon, Maura Connolly. I think it's a sign of the importance of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Lebanon, that we have one of our most esteemed, one of our most respected, and one of our most skilled foreign service officers here in Beirut serving as our ambassador. Anybody who wants to understand if Lebanon is really important in Washington to President Obama, to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, need only look at who we sent to represent us here in Beirut. So thank you, Ambassador. And I'm honored by your presence as well. So I'm going to speak just very briefly about the intersection of social media and free speech. And I want to share from the outset, I've been working for the last 6 years for Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. The last 4 years for Hillary Clinton, the 2 years before that, running technology, media, and telecommunications policy for Barack Obama's presidential campaign, which is why Hillary hired me. If I've learned one thing in the last 6 years, it's that there is a significant shift in geopolitical power taking place globally right now. Now, most people who talk about shifts in geopolitical power do so on a geographic basis. They say power is moving from the United States and Europe to Asia, or from the global north to the global south. Now, whether that is true or not, I will leave to other people to discuss. But what I do know with near certainty is that in nearly all 195 countries on planet Earth, there is a shift in geopolitical power. And this shift in power is from hierarchies to citizens and networks of citizens. There's a shift in power taking place all over the world right now, from hierarchies like government, like large media organizations. And the shift in power is to citizens and networks of citizens. And the shift in power is facilitated by connection technologies. Technologies that connect people to information and to each other, like, for example, social media. Now, what's interesting in the midst of all of this is if any of you who do understand power, understand that power is never given up willingly. And the shift in power to citizens it scares governments quite often. And look, I say this from arguably the world's most powerful government. This citizen power can overwhelm government. It changes the distribution of power. It makes movement making faster. It can be very disruptive. And I think that the way that governments and other hierarchies respond to the empowerment of citizens is a measure of their values, and a measure of whether they really respect their people, and a measure of whether they really want their citizens to be empowered. A lot of governments right now are cracking down on social media. They're cracking down on free speech in the internet, and they're doing so in the name of security. Some people view security and liberty as being equal and opposite. The more security you have, the less liberty you have. The more liberty you have, the less security you have. I think that this is a false argument. And I think that what we have to do on social media and on the internet generally is achieve a balance between security and liberty. The two can coexist. And we must remember that security without liberty is oppressive, and liberty without security is dangerous. The two have to coexist in harmony. Now, a large basis for the discussion about liberty and security and the discussion about the power of social media in political contexts comes from the Arab revolutions. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about social media in the context of these revolutions. Some people call these revolutions Facebook revolutions or Twitter revolutions. They were not. Social media did not cause these revolutions, and it did not make them successful. These are not Twitter revolutions. These are not Facebook revolutions. I think that the revolutions had far more to do with things like a lack of democratic participation, a lack of economic opportunity, anger at ruling families, anger at high levels of corruption, and high food prices. Those 5 things had more to do with the making of revolutions in the Arab world than Facebook or Twitter. Now, I do think, though, that we can look now with the benefit of some retrospection and say that while these were not Facebook or Twitter revolutions, they didn't cause the revolutions. I do think that we can definitively say that they did do 3 things. The first thing is it accelerated movement making. It didn't make the revolutions, but it did make them go faster. And that's in part because of the relatively open platforms that are social media. It allows for participation and engagement in a way that wasn't previously possible. The second thing is it enriches the information environment. Raise your hand if you have heard of Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian who lit himself on fire. Okay. Just about all of you. Raise your hand now if you heard about the protests that took place in the Gafsa mining basin in Tunisia 2 years before Bouazizi. I see 2 hands. Let me explain why I ask those questions. In 2008, protests began in the Gafsa mining basin in Tunisia that were far larger than those that started in the smaller, less populated area of Sidi Bouzid, where Mohamed Bouazizi lit himself on fire. So why do you all know who Bouazizi is and none of you know about the protests in the Gafsa mining basin? Why did one start the Arab revolutions and why go nowhere? Let me explain why. In 2008, when protests began in the Gafsa mining basin in Tunisia, the Ben Ali government was able to contain the information environment. There were only 28,000 Facebook accounts in Tunisia, basically the Sorbonne-educated sons and daughters of the elite. They were the only in Tunis. These were the only ones that had Facebook accounts. Everybody's cell phones, all you did on your phone was make phone calls. And so when the protests began, the police were able to crack down on the protests, and they were able to, through the television and the newspapers and the radio, say, oh, there were some troublemakers, but the protests are gone now. 2 years later, Mohamed Bouazizi lit himself on fire on December 17th of 2010. On December 18th, his mother and other family members began protesting outside the police headquarters in small town Sidi Bouzid. The people who watched the protests now, though, had smartphones. And what they did is they captured the images of these protests on their smartphones. Those images were then carried throughout, were then spread through social media. And even though there were only 28,000 Facebook accounts in 2008, in 2010 there were 1.4 million. From 28,000 to 1.4 million in 2 years, 19% of the population. And the Ben Ali government was not able to control the information that was flowing over social media or that was flowing over these cell phones. So the ability of a dictator to control the information environment was reduced. So the second thing we can say that connection technologies have done in revolution is it has enriched the information environment. It is harder for a dictator to control what information people get. The third thing is it facilitates leaderlessness. There's nobody's face you're going to put on a t-shirt from the revolutions in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, or elsewhere. That's not to say that these movements are not without leaders, but if you actually look at the leadership structures of the Arab revolutions right now, they look more like the internet itself, more like a web than like a pyramid, which is top down. And this is both good and bad. It's good in that the revolutions are more citizen-centered and less based on a cult of personality. It's bad in that once a revolution is over, there's no leader around which a country will come together. There's no Nelson Mandela like there was in South Africa. There's no Václav Havel like there was in Czechoslovakia. There's no Lech Walesa like there was in Poland. And there also aren't institutions that have been built up over years that can help govern once a government has been overthrown. So I share all of this not by way of advocacy. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but merely by way of explanation. So these were not Facebook revolutions or Twitter revolutions, but we can see technology does play a meaningful role in helping to build and accelerate movements. Now, in the face of this, I think it's interesting to understand some of the motivations behind governments in saying this. Well, if we are losing control, and if suddenly citizens have all kinds of power to hold us accountable for corruption, for a lack of economic opportunity or other such things, can we control the internet? And let me say, in the United States, we invented the internet. The United Kingdom, they invented the World Wide Web. We invented the internet. We invented the search engine. We invented the web browser. We invented all of these different things in the United States, and we can't control it. We can't control it. Every minute, every 1 minute, 60 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube. Every month, 4 billion hours of video is watched on YouTube. In 2011, there were more than 1 trillion views on YouTube, which is the equivalent of all 7 billion people on planet Earth watching 130 videos. In this kind of world, we can't control the kind of content that goes onto the internet. And it doesn't matter if you are China and spending billions of dollars a year and employing 50,000 people to do nothing but censor the internet, it doesn't work. It doesn't matter if you're the United States and many of these companies are American and you control the platforms. You can't control the content that is on there. The 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. So in the face of this, what do we do with offensive content? The most productive thing we can do with offensive speech on the internet is the same thing we do with offensive speech in real life. We hold it accountable to the rule of law. We ignore it, we isolate it, we condemn it. We do not empower it. But I'm here to tell you, and look, a lot of my friends run these big internet companies. What we are not going to be able to do in a world where 60 hours of video is uploaded every minute, what we're not going to be able to do is have a bureaucrat from government like me in a suit and tie look at every video and say, this one is okay, this one's okay, that one's not. It's not going to work. So what we have to do is we have to exercise responsibility as a society to isolate offensive content and not empower it. The final point that I want to make is that all of these issues of free speech and the internet are also of great economic consequence. Globalization is changing the nature of the global economy. During the agricultural age, fertile land was the raw material. During the industrial age, iron was the raw material. In the information age, data is the raw material. And if you think about the kind of infrastructure that is going to propel the economies of the future, 18th century infrastructure was ports. 19th century infrastructure was railroads. 20th century infrastructure was roads, highways. 21st century infrastructure is high-speed broadband networks. Any economy around the globe that wants to create a knowledge-based economy must have an open internet, because the very nature of the internet itself and the innovation that flows from connectedness inevitably comes from open societies. And what I would advise, and what I frequently advise leaders of countries in the Middle East, is if you want sources of wealth other than oil and gas, if you really want to have a knowledge-based economy, then you have to have an ecosystem in your country that allows for innovation and that supports openness. Otherwise, you can look at other parts of the world and you can see the kind of innovation and entrepreneurship that's going to create the high-paid jobs of the future. And this is as important for the United States as it is for anybody else. In the United States, we don't really have many factories anymore. Our ports are not what they once used to be. We have to have a knowledge-based economy if we are going to remain a great power. And so this is a struggle for us too. This is a struggle for us too. This is not the case of an American sort of wagging his finger and saying, oh, you better be like us or you're going to be poor. No, this is a struggle for us too. Because those of us in government, those of us who concern ourselves with matters of security, recognize that our lives would be far easier and far more pleasant if the relatively chaotic space that is the internet were under control. But it can't be and it won't be, and if we seek to control it, what we will do is throttle back our own economy. These issues are difficult. I think that they are going to only grow in importance as the internet grows in power. And I appreciate the opportunity that we have today to discuss this in an open environment and have what I think are going to be some very good and very stimulating sessions. And so I want to close by thanking Dr. May Chidiac again for doing such an impressive job and pulling together people from around the world. And with that, and with great humility and great respect, I thank you.